Hi everyone, it's Angela from Happy Dotting Company. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to do an update on casting. The first video I made on casting was about 5 years ago. The content is actually still good. However, there were a couple of common questions that I missed in that video, and I've also learned a lot of tips and tricks along the way, and a lot of things that other experienced people with casting have offered me. So this is hopefully a comprehensive video that will address all those common questions and maybe even some new things. So thank you for joining us, and let's get into it. Okay, let's get into it. So firstly, I want to say I apologise if this video chops and changes a little bit, because I may add things in when I'm editing it just to make sure that I end up adding everything that I intended. I hope it hangs together well, but we'll see how that goes. So since my last casting video, Happy Dotting Company has actually produced many more products. We have a range of molds, we have a range of templates and silicons, all sorts of things, marker pens and all sorts of things on our website. So if you're interested in looking at the range, you will see the link in the description below, and you will also see a discount coupon to enjoy. Okay, so the first thing we'll talk about is casting powders. Now, I mentioned that today I'm going to use Ultracal 30, which happens to be my favourite. However, lots of casting powders work really well. You don't have to use Ultracal 30. Basically, what casting powder you use will depend where you live and the availability. It will also depend on your budget. It will also depend whether you want to have the rocks or whatever you cast inside or outside. So the things to consider with casting powders is that obviously there's a big difference in price, but also there's a big difference in how fragile or porous the casting powder will be. So in other words, if you use a really soft casting powder, like for instance plaster of Paris, you're much more likely to have it fracture, or have bits chip off, or have a sort of like a chalkiness to it, or even break the casting as it's coming out of the mold. What I mean by that is that, say I was doing using plaster of Paris for this one, the chances of chipping it when I'm taking this out would be quite high. But having said that, it is repairable, and we'll talk about that later. So lots of casting plasters work well. On our website, we do provide a mixing sheet for both Ultracal 30 and also another one that's available in Australia called Casting Plaster. I also have been told that dental stone plaster, which is also available by by Gyprock brand, available in Bunnings, has the same measurements. I don't have a bag of that available to check, but I have been told that that's correct, so that's great. But we have all these measurements worked out to make it as easy as possible to get the right quantities mixed with minimal waste for use in our molds. So we have these 2 pages worth with all the measurements worked out. Now, I always use metric. I actually find it terribly difficult to even think in imperial. I know that a lot of people have the opposite problem, but I'm going to be using metric today. And metric obviously is a lot easier to add up if you're not, as opposed to imperial, if you're not converting ounces to pounds. So that's what we're going to do today. Now, for the sake of not dragging this video out, I have pre-measured my quantities and what I'm going to do here. But the first thing that we're going to talk about is bubbles. Bubbles are the nemesis of casting. But having said that, they can be fixed if there are bubbles appear in the castings, but we're going to talk about how to prevent them in the first place. For a long time now, I have been using a surfactant when I cast. Now, a surfactant is basically a substance that reduces the tension of surfaces, and therefore it really helps to reduce the likelihood of bubble locks in your castings. Now, it's actually really not necessary for simple molds. So what I mean by that is simple molds is something like this. It's just basically a very plain shape. But when you have molds like this, it's quite easy to get bubble locks, particularly around the rim there in the crevices. But we're going to talk about different ways to handle that. Now, to make up a surfactant, it's basically a dilute mix of dishwashing liquid in some water. So I have put about half a teaspoon of dishwashing liquid into about 1 cup of water, and I use this spray. Another option to essentially have a surfactant sitting in your molds is that you can wash your molds after you've used them in a soapy mix, if you like, in your laundry sink or something, and essentially don't completely wash that off. So in other words, once you go to use your molds again, there's going to be some residue of that surfactant already sitting in your molds, and that will really help. So they're the two options, but I've always sprayed in the complicated molds, and I've just found that consistently helps. And honestly, I rarely get bubble locks in my molds. So that's my experience. Now, one other little trick that I've learned along the way, and this is through my own experimenting, is to actually use this product here, which is Simethicone. Now, it's actually, people will know it as Infacol. I think it has some other brand names. You find it in chemists or supermarkets, and it actually helps children, babies with colic. So I'm actually an anaesthetic nurse by trade, and we use this in scopes, and what it does is it actually reduces the amount of bubbles that's in people's stomach, so that the doctor seeing the camera in person's stomach doesn't have a heap of bubbles to look at. They can actually get a really good view. So I discovered this a long time ago, and I use a tiny drop sometimes in paint when I've mixed a paint, and then suddenly you get a lot of bubbles. It really works. So I've had this for a long time. It lasts a long time, and I just bought it from my local supermarket. Now I've got a bottle of water here that I'm going to use for casting, and I can see that it's actually got some bubbles in it, and that's just tap water. I'm going to put a bit of this in there. This is completely optional. You do not have to do this, but this is what I do. So I've mixed that through, and there's less bubbles. Okay, so now for the surfactant. As I said, we're going to mix this one today, and we're also going to do this one. And I've already worked out the quantities for these using the mix sheet. So I'm just going to spray that, and I'm actually going to get my finger and make sure that it's really got into all those places in there, all those little nooks and crannies. And this one, and I'm going to do the same. There we go. Now those are ready to be poured into. Before we go any further, I should mention that a little bit about safety. Now, I always use just one glove so that I can actually touch the mix when I'm mixing it. It helps me actually feel any bubbles that are in it. But the other thing is, because it's a powder, I highly recommend that people do use a mask. I mean, we've all got a mask lying around from COVID, right? So I don't think it's a big deal to use a mask, and or make sure you're working in a well ventilated area. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do, I have a bucket big, oh, I don't know whether you call it a bucket, it's like a cheap jug, and oh, I'm trying to work out how I can see the scales here for you. I might just adjust the camera a moment. Okay, I think that's a better angle. You can see what the scales say here. It's some digital scales, which are better than old-fashioned analog scales. First thing I'm going to do is take it to 0, so tare it. And we're going to start with the water, and I've worked that out to be 353 grams. Okay, we've got a little bit over there, but that will be fine. And then we tare it again. And now I'm going to add the powder, which, like I mentioned before, I've actually already worked this out. So I'm just going to give that a moment just to do its own thing. We don't need the scales anymore. Now in the meantime, I'm just going to turn these over, because what we don't want is sort of like a pool of mist sitting in the moulds. And I'm going to just start giving this a turn. It's actually really quite fun, this. So I'm just massaging it with my hand. So obviously the mix has got a bit of body to it, but it's fairly liquid. You would probably call it a runny sort of a custard. You don't want to spend too long doing this. You don't want to actually sort of mix it really hard, otherwise you might end up actually creating a problem with bubbles. But that looks really good to me. So now we'll turn these over and pour these in. Now really try to resist overfilling your moulds, because it just will create a problem with trying to make them smooth on top. And that's about perfect. So really not much mix left over there, probably about 10 mils. So I've taken off my glove. Now I just want to give the moulds, I'll bring this over more into a better view. Just give them a little bit of a tap. As you can see, there's really next to no bubbles. I can see some micro bubbles there. That wouldn't actually bother me. But if you see more, there's things that we can do. Now, I recently learnt from the Australian and New Zealand group video that they made, that they like to use a little brush and actually go around where you might get a bubble lock and under here, under the edges. I've never done this before, but you know, it's probably a nice idea. There we go. And if you get more bubbles, like I can actually see more bubbles after doing that now, you can use some alcohol spray. So if you just give that just a quick burst, no bubbles. There you go. And honestly, that should be absolutely fine then. You need to let that set well. I generally tend to leave them overnight, But I would say with this particular mix, and it will vary depending on what mix you use, at least sort of 4 or 6 hours before you want to pop them out. They will turn warm, but I don't feel like they're very hot, but you will feel them get warm, and often they will have a film of water on top. You really don't need to worry about that. That's absolutely fine. You can just leave it. In terms of the cleanup now, I will actually take this outside and hose the bucket onto, my grass or my garden. It's really important that you don't put, leftover casting mix down the drain. That will lead to plumbing problems if you do it often, so I would really avoid doing that. Another alternative is that I do see people mixing the entire mix in a disposable plastic bag, or a reusable silicone bag is an option as well. But if you're going to use a silicone bag, then obviously if you're going to be washing it up, you need to be careful that you're not washing it down your household sink. I would again wash it outside. But I find this sort of bucket ideal, and really it takes me about 2 seconds to wash it out with the hose. I do appreciate that not everybody has a garden, or you live in a unit or something like that. So, maybe using a bag is an option for you if that's the case. Probably one of the hardest things about casting is actually waiting for the castings, once you've demolded them, to be dry enough to paint. So this is a common question, and it is one that I missed out in my original casting clip. But essentially you want to wait for the castings to be completely dry. And for a big casting like this one, that actually means an entire week. Now that may vary depending on your climate and how much humidity you have. For a very small casting, then maybe it only takes 3 or 4 days. But if you don't wait and there's still moisture in the casting, that can actually lead to problems with paint adherence. So I suggest, the thing to do is to actually make a heap of castings and have them completely ready to paint, whenever you feel like it. And so in other words, you want to make those castings in advance. I just wanted to talk about now the options if you did find some roughness on your castings, or you did find a little hole or something that you want to fix up. A nice gentleman in Australia put me onto this. It's just basically a really coarse sanding pad. And if you have some roughness on the back of your mold, it's super easy just to grab your mold and rub it over like that to try and get it a bit smoother. It's much easier to do this when the casting is fresh out of the mold and the casting is basically soft rather than, really, really hard after about a week. The other thing is I had to search around for this casting actually, just to find one with a little hole in it. Can you see that little hole just there? Now, if I wanted to fill this hole, what I've been using is this product called Rapid Spack Fill. It's paintable, and I just basically put a tiny bit on my finger and manipulate it into the hole there, like that. And let that dry. It actually dries really quick, so probably just a couple of hours, and then it's actually ready to paint, and you would never know that's there. So that's an option too. Okay, so these are now cool to touch. It's been quite a few hours, so I'm going to pop these out. So that's the larger one, and that really looks perfect. I actually can't see any bubbles whatsoever on that. The surface is really smooth. On the back there's a few little micro bubbles around the edge, but honestly that actually would not bother me. By the time you put paint on that, you're not going to see it. And it certainly feels smooth to touch. You could sand it if you wanted to, but I mean, I probably wouldn't bother. I'll do this one. Sorry, I'm actually holding it against my body so that I can release it. We have actually recently revised a couple of the moulds, including this one. It used to have the HDC logo and it used to be a blue colour, so if you're familiar with our moulds, it's now this colour, the revised one. And again, that's absolutely no problems at all. Really smooth, no air bubbles, no locks. A few little micro bubbles around the edge here, but again, I wouldn't worry about that. It actually feels smooth to touch. So there you go. So look, I want to say a really big thank you to all the people that have contributed to the Facebook post that I have pinned in my Facebook page. It's about casting, and people often contribute there about their experiences with different casting mixes. I think I actually forgot to mention at the beginning of the video that if you want to cast with products and then leave the stones outside, you probably need to consider a more cement-based mix. So by that I mean, for instance, you know, like a rapid set cement oil or something like that. I don't have a lot of experience with those types of mixes because I just don't make things that, you know, I intend to put outside. However, I think that's the solution. However, it's not the only issue with putting your art outside. You also need to consider what paint you use and what sealant you use. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this today. Thank you so much for your support. I'll be able to put a lot of the details about alternative casting mixes and so forth in the description below, as well as some credits and things to people whom I want to thank. So thanks again for watching, and happy dotting.